The dawn sky over Tinian Island was still dark when Colonel Paul Tibbets climbed aboard the gleaming silver B-29 Super Fortress. He had named the aircraft after his mother, Enola Gay, though she would soon be associated with something far beyond a mother's love. What happened in the next 12 hours would forever divide human history, the moment before atomic weapons and everything after. The crew of 12 men aboard the bomber carried not just a new type of bomb, but the culmination of the most expensive scientific undertaking in history, the $2 billion Manhattan Project. As the massive propellers began to turn at 02:45 on August 6, 1945, the weight of this responsibility sat as heavily on Tibbets's shoulders as the 9,000-pound uranium device secured in the bomb bay beneath him. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The Enola Gay's mission was the product of years of secret development, political calculation, and military necessity. By the summer of 1945, World War II in Europe had ended with Germany's surrender, but the Pacific War against Japan raged on with increasing ferocity. American forces had fought their way across the Pacific in a brutal island-hopping campaign that saw some of the war's bloodiest battles: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and most recently, Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa alone resulted in over 200,000 deaths, including 100,000 Japanese soldiers, at least 80,000 civilians, and nearly 20,000 Americans. U.S. military planners looked at the Japanese home islands with dread, estimating casualties in the millions if a full-scale invasion became necessary. President Harry S. Truman, who had assumed office only months earlier, following the death of Franklin Roosevelt, faced a momentous decision. The Manhattan Project, begun in secret in 1942, had produced two types of atomic weapons, one using uranium-235 and another using plutonium. The first successful test, codenamed Trinity, had been conducted just 3 weeks earlier on July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert. The explosion had exceeded even the scientists' expectations. The weapon's creator, J. Robert Oppenheimer, later recalled that a line from Hindu scripture came to mind: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Truman, informed of the test's success while attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, made the fateful decision to use the new weapon against Japan if the country did not surrender unconditionally. As the Enola Gay began its takeoff roll down Tinian's Northfield runway, the weight of its special cargo forced Tibbets to use the entire 8,800-foot length to become airborne. The aircraft struggled into the air at 02:45, beginning the 1,800-mile journey to Japan. The mission had been planned with extraordinary precision. 3 weather reconnaissance aircraft had departed earlier to assess conditions over the primary target, Hiroshima, and the alternate targets of Kokura and Nagasaki. 2 observation B-29s would accompany the Enola Gay to record the bombing and measure its effects. One carried scientists and cameras. The other contained instruments to measure the blast and radiation. The bombing altitude was set at 31,000 feet, high enough to give the Enola Gay time to escape the blast effects. The bomb itself, nicknamed Little Boy, was armed in flight. Navy Captain William D. Parsons, the weaponeer, climbed into the bomb bay shortly after takeoff and began the delicate process of inserting the cordite charges that would initiate the nuclear chain reaction. This dangerous procedure was necessary because Tibbets had insisted the bomb not be armed on the ground, fearing that a crash on takeoff would result in a nuclear detonation on Tinian. The men who flew the mission were a carefully selected team, many of whom had no idea of the true nature of their cargo until the final briefing. Tibbets, the pilot and mission commander, had been chosen for his exceptional flying skills and leadership abilities. He had flown the first American bombing mission over German-occupied Europe in 1942 and had been involved in the B-29 program since its inception. Captain Robert Lewis, the co-pilot, would later become known for his haunting diary entry after witnessing the explosion. Major Thomas Farabee, the bombardier, would be responsible for releasing the weapon over the aiming point, the Aioi Bridge in central Hiroshima, chosen for its distinctive T-shape that made it easily identifiable from the air. Captain Theodore Dutch Van Kirk served as navigator, ensuring the bomber found its target over 1,800 miles of open ocean. Staff Sergeant George Caron manned the tailgun position and would be one of the few crew members to see the explosion from beginning to end. The crew had trained together for months, practicing high-altitude precision bombing runs without knowing the actual purpose of their training. Only in the final weeks did Tibbets and a few key officers learn the full scope of their mission. Even then, many details of the bomb's power remained theoretical until the moment of detonation. Throughout the 7-hour flight, the crew maintained strict radio silence. Some tried to sleep, others checked and rechecked their instruments and procedures. Tibbets later recalled that the mood was professional but tense. They knew their mission was unique, though few understood exactly how powerful the new weapon would be. Tibbets himself had been told that the bomb had the equivalent explosive force of 20,000 tons of TNT, but such figures were almost impossible to comprehend. The only man aboard who fully grasped the weapon's revolutionary nature was Captain Parsons, who had been deeply involved in its development. Years later, co-pilot Robert Lewis would write in his journal, "I'm certain the youngsters were confident in me and in Colonel Tibbets. If they had known what we were going to do, I'm sure we would have had a much different trip." Just an hour before reaching the target, Japanese radar detected the small formation of American planes, and air raid alerts were sounded in several cities, including Hiroshima. However, with only a handful of aircraft appearing on radar, Japanese commanders did not scramble fighters or order a general air raid alert. The practice of sending small groups of reconnaissance planes had conditioned the defenders not to react strongly to every sighting. This decision would prove catastrophic for the citizens of Hiroshima. The atomic bomb that rested in the Enola Gay's bomb bay represented the culmination of one of history's most remarkable scientific endeavors. The Manhattan Project had begun in 1942, following Albert Einstein's famous letter to President Roosevelt warning of the possibility that Nazi Germany might develop an atomic weapon. The project grew to employ over 130,000 people at secret facilities across the United States, though only a small fraction knew the true purpose of their work. The main production sites included Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where enormous gaseous diffusion plants enriched uranium, Hanford, Washington, where reactors produced plutonium, and Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the scientific team led by J. Robert Oppenheimer designed and built the actual weapons. The project brought together the finest scientific minds of the era, many of them refugees from European fascism, in an unprecedented collaboration. Enrico Fermi, who had fled Mussolini's Italy, had achieved the first controlled nuclear chain reaction at the University of Chicago in 1942, proving the theoretical possibility of both nuclear power and nuclear weapons. Hungarian-born physicist Leo Szilard, who had first conceived the nuclear chain reaction, worked alongside Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, and dozens of other brilliant scientists and engineers. The project cost approximately $2 billion, equivalent to about $29 billion today, and was conducted in such secrecy that Vice President Truman didn't learn of its existence until he became president following Roosevelt's death in April 1945. The weapon itself used a relatively simple gun-type design in which one subcritical mass of uranium-235 was fired into another, creating a supercritical mass and initiating the chain reaction. This design was considered reliable enough that it did not require testing before combat use, unlike the more complex plutonium implosion device that would later be dropped on Nagasaki. Hiroshima in 1945 was a city of about 350,000 people. It had largely escaped the devastating conventional bombing that had destroyed much of urban Japan. This was by design. American military planners had deliberately spared Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki, and Kyoto from major bombing to preserve them as potential targets for the atomic bomb, allowing for a clearer assessment of the new weapon's power. Hiroshima had significant military value as well. It housed the headquarters of the Japanese Second General Army, responsible for the defense of southern Japan, and served as an important port and logistics center. When the weather reports came in that morning, they indicated clear skies over Hiroshima, perfect bombing conditions. The Enola Gay continued toward the primary target. At 08:15 local time, as the citizens of Hiroshima were beginning their day, children heading to school, workers to factories, families preparing breakfast, the Enola Gay approached from the east. The bomb bay doors opened, and little boy fell free. The morning of August the 6th in Hiroshima had begun like any other wartime day. Air raid sirens had sounded earlier when American weather planes were detected, but the all clear had been given. Civilians were going about their morning routines, eating breakfast, commuting to work, children heading to school or helping clear fire breaks in the city as a precaution against conventional bombing. The city's military facilities were operating normally, with soldiers drilling and officers planning for the expected American invasion. Hiroshima had been lucky thus far in the war. While Tokyo and other major cities had been devastated by firebombing, Hiroshima had experienced only minor raids. Some residents had begun to wonder if their city held some special significance that had spared it from destruction. They could not have known that this apparent good fortune was actually by design. Hiroshima had been preserved as a pristine target to demonstrate the full effects of a new type of weapon. The city's physical characteristics had also made it an ideal target. Built on a river delta with 6 channels dividing it, Hiroshima was relatively flat, allowing the blast wave to propagate without obstruction. The city's military significance, industrial capacity, and size, large enough to demonstrate the bomb's power, but not so large that the bomb would seem inadequate, had all factored into its selection from the target list. Major Farabee in the Enola Gay's bombardier seat identified the distinctive T-shaped Aioi Bridge in the city center. At precisely 08:15:17 local time, little boy was released from an altitude of 31,060 feet. The bomber immediately banked in a diving turn to gain speed and distance from the blast. The bomb took 43 seconds to fall to its predetermined detonation height of approximately 1,100 feet above the city. The goal was an airburst that would maximize the area affected by the blast. At the moment of detonation, the uranium gun-type device slammed a subcritical mass of uranium-235 into another, creating a supercritical mass and initiating a nuclear chain reaction. The physics of what happened next transpired in microseconds, but the effects would last for generations. A blinding flash lit the morning sky. Witnesses as far as 400 miles away would report seeing it. A fireball with temperatures reaching millions of degrees formed, rising rapidly into the atmosphere and creating the now iconic mushroom cloud. The blast wave expanded outward at supersonic speed, destroying buildings for miles around. The thermal radiation caused flash burns on exposed skin up to 3 miles from ground zero. In the Enola Gay, which had turned sharply away after releasing the bomb, the shock wave hit the aircraft about 40 seconds after detonation, jolting it violently despite being nearly 11 miles from the blast. Co-pilot Robert Lewis scribbled in his log, "My God, what have we done?" The moment of detonation created a flash of light brighter than any in human history up to that point. Survivors would later report that the light seemed to come from everywhere at once, casting multiple shadows. The initial flash was followed by a tremendous blast wave and searing heat. The temperature at the hypocenter reached approximately 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to vaporize human beings and melt tile and stone. The blast wave, traveling at supersonic speed, destroyed buildings out to a radius of 1 mile, with severe structural damage extending much further. The thermal pulse ignited flammable materials throughout the city, starting thousands of individual fires that quickly merged into a firestorm. The blast created hurricane-force winds that spread the fires and wreaked additional havoc. Those closest to the hypocenter died instantly, their bodies reduced to ash and carbon. Others, horribly burned, died more slowly from their injuries, thermal burns, or radiation poisoning. The radiation effects, completely unknown to the victims, would continue to kill for days, weeks, months, and even years afterward. In the immediate aftermath, survivors described a landscape transformed into hell. Buildings collapsed into rubble, charred bodies lining the streets, badly burned victims calling for water, the city shrouded in smoke and dust. Many survivors were covered in black soot and burned so badly they were unrecognizable. One survivor, a young doctor named Michihiko Hachiya, wrote in his diary, "The scene I witnessed was so terrible that it cannot be described in words. It was truly a living hell." On the ground, the destruction was immediate and comprehensive. In a 1-mile radius around the hypocenter, the devastation was nearly total. The blast, heat, and resulting fires destroyed approximately 70,000 of the 76,000 buildings in Hiroshima. The official Japanese report later determined that 69% of the city's buildings were destroyed and another 6–7% damaged. The human toll was catastrophic. People nearest to the hypocenter were vaporized instantly, leaving only shadows burned onto walls and streets. Others died from the overwhelming pressure of the blast wave or were crushed in collapsing buildings. Many who survived the immediate blast succumbed to severe burns. In the days, weeks, and years that followed, radiation sickness would claim thousands more lives. Survivors of the bombing, known as hibakusha, would face both health complications and social discrimination for decades to come. The aftermath in Hiroshima revealed scenes of unimaginable horror. The city's hospital system had been largely destroyed in the blast, with most medical professionals among the dead or injured. The few surviving doctors and nurses, often injured themselves, worked with virtually no supplies or equipment. Dr. Terufumi Sasaki, one of only a handful of physicians who survived uninjured, found himself the only doctor standing in the largest remaining hospital, surrounded by thousands of severely wounded patients. The injuries were unlike anything medical personnel had ever encountered. Terrible burns combined with mysterious symptoms of radiation sickness, nausea, vomiting, fever, hair loss, bleeding gums, and purple subcutaneous hemorrhages. Without understanding the cause, doctors could do little more than provide comfort. Clean water was scarce, medicines almost non-existent, and basic medical supplies like bandages quickly exhausted. The city's infrastructure had been obliterated. No electricity, no running water, no functioning fire department to combat the numerous fires, no transportation system to evacuate the wounded. Communication with the outside world was severed, delaying the arrival of relief efforts. The Japanese government in Tokyo initially received only fragmentary information about what had happened in Hiroshima. When the first reports of unprecedented destruction arrived, many officials found them difficult to believe. It was not until the following day that the true scale of the catastrophe began to be understood. Even then, Japanese authorities had no concept of nuclear weapons or radiation effects. It would be the American announcement of the new atomic weapon that finally explained to Japan's leaders what had actually occurred. As the Enola Gay returned to Tinian, the crew remained largely silent, processing what they had witnessed. Tibbets was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross immediately upon landing. Asked about his feelings regarding the mission, he maintained the perspective of a military officer who had done his duty. "I sleep clearly every night." Not all of the crew shared this certainty. Co-pilot Robert Lewis, who had written that haunting question in his log, would later struggle with the moral implications of their mission. However, most of the crew, reflecting the attitudes of their time and the brutal context of the Pacific War, believed they had helped end the conflict and save lives that would have been lost in an invasion of Japan. The question of whether the atomic bombings were necessary or justified remains one of history's most debated ethical questions. It cannot be separated from the broader context of the Pacific War's escalating brutality, from Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and subsequent atrocities across Asia, to the increasingly devastating American bombing campaign against Japanese cities. The crew of the Enola Gay returned to Tinian at 2:58 p.m., the flight having taken just under 12 hours. General Carl Spaatz pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on Tibbets while he was still standing in front of his aircraft. The debriefing that followed was detailed and comprehensive, with crew members describing everything they had witnessed. Scientists were particularly interested in the descriptions of the blast effects, mushroom cloud formation, and any unusual phenomena observed. Meanwhile, intelligence officers were already analyzing reconnaissance photographs taken by the observation aircraft to assess the bomb's effectiveness. The initial reports confirmed unprecedented destruction, though the full extent would not be known for some time. For the crew, the mission marked the culmination of months of specialized training, though many had only learned its true purpose in the preceding days or hours. Their reactions varied. Some, like Tibbets, viewed it as a necessary military action that would ultimately save lives by ending the war quickly. Others experienced more complex emotions. Tail gunner George Caron later recalled, "The mushroom cloud itself was a spectacular sight beyond the imagination. But I was convinced that the war would soon be over and that the use of this weapon would save more lives than it destroyed." Flight engineer Wyatt Dusenbury would later say, "After we got the reports of how many had died, I was sorry for the people who were killed, but I was glad that it wasn't any of our boys." For most, the compartmentalization typical of combat operations provided some psychological buffer. They had performed their assigned mission with skill and precision. The moral calculations about using atomic weapons would largely fall to others, from President Truman to the American public, and ultimately to history itself. 3 days after Hiroshima, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb, a plutonium implosion-type device nicknamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing an estimated 75,000 people immediately. The second bombing occurred amid confusion in Tokyo, where Japanese leaders were still trying to comprehend the first attack while simultaneously debating how to respond to the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan, which had come on August 8th. On August 10th, the Japanese government sent a message indicating its intention to surrender, with the condition that the position of the emperor be preserved. After further deliberation in Washington, on August 14th, Emperor Hirohito recorded an unprecedented radio address announcing Japan's surrender, though without using that exact word. The formal surrender ceremony took place aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. Officially ending World War II. The decision to drop a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki came with its own complex history. The original target for the second bombing had been Kokura, but cloud cover over that city led to the selection of the secondary target, Nagasaki. The bombing itself was carried out by a B-29 named Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney. The mission experienced several problems. A fuel transfer pump failed, meaning the aircraft could not access its reserve fuel. The primary target was obscured, and radio communications were problematic. After making 3 passes over Kokura with no visibility of the aiming point, Sweeney made the decision to proceed to Nagasaki, despite fuel concerns. Even there, the city was partially obscured by clouds, and the bomb was dropped using radar targeting rather than visual sighting, missing the intended aim point by almost 2 miles. The plutonium implosion device, far more complex than the Hiroshima bomb, had a yield of about 21 kilotons, slightly more powerful than Little Boy. Due to Nagasaki's hilly terrain and the off-target detonation, the destruction while severe, was somewhat more contained than at Hiroshima. Nevertheless, the human toll was devastating. After releasing the bomb, Bockscar barely made it to an emergency landing at Okinawa, its fuel tanks nearly empty. The two atomic bombings, combined with the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan on August 8th, finally convinced Emperor Hirohito to intervene in the government's deliberations and accept surrender. Even then, a faction of hardline military officers attempted a coup on the night of August 14-15 to prevent the surrender announcement from being broadcast. The coup failed, and at noon on August 15th, Japanese citizens heard the emperor's voice on the radio for the first time as he announced that Japan would endure the unendurable and accept the Allied terms. The immediate aftermath of the bombings saw a flurry of activity. American scientists and military personnel entered Hiroshima and Nagasaki to study the effects of the weapons. Their findings would contribute to both civil defense planning and the development of more powerful nuclear weapons. The survivors faced immediate challenges of rebuilding their lives amid widespread destruction, radiation sickness, and severe shortages of food, clean water, and medical supplies. Many suffered from horrific burns and other injuries, with little medical assistance available. The psychological trauma was equally severe. Survivors reported experiencing survivor's guilt, post-traumatic stress, and profound existential crises. Many kept their experiences secret for decades, fearing discrimination in marriage and employment. Japan's reconstruction would be a decades-long process, though the country's economic recovery would eventually become one of the great success stories of the post-war era. Hiroshima and Nagasaki themselves were rebuilt as modern cities, with Hiroshima in particular embracing its identity as a center for peace activism. The American occupation of Japan, led by General Douglas MacArthur, began almost immediately after the surrender. American forces, prepared for fierce resistance based on the fanatical defense of Okinawa and other islands, were surprised by the generally orderly and compliant reception they received. The occupation would last until 1952 and fundamentally transform Japanese society. One of the occupation's first actions regarding the bombed cities was to establish the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, ABCC, to study the medical effects of radiation on survivors. This organization, while providing valuable scientific data, was controversial among Hibakusha, many of whom felt they were being treated as research subjects rather than patients in need of treatment. The ABCC studied but did not provide medical care. American censorship during the occupation also prevented widespread reporting on the bombing's effects or criticism of the American decision to use atomic weapons. Photographs and footage of the bombings and their aftermath were classified, and Japanese publications were prohibited from discussing certain aspects of the attacks. This censorship contributed to a lack of understanding in America about the human consequences of the bombings. It was not until the end of the occupation that the full story began to emerge internationally. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki themselves, recovery proceeded in stages. Emergency relief efforts were followed by basic rebuilding of infrastructure and eventually by comprehensive urban planning for modern cities. Hiroshima, in particular, chose to preserve the ruins of the A-bomb dome, formerly the Industrial Promotion Hall, as a memorial and to rebuild the city around a dedicated peace park and museum, making the experience and memory of the bombing central to the city's new identity. For the United States, the bombings marked both the triumphant end of World War II and the beginning of profound new responsibilities. America's monopoly on atomic weapons was brief. The Soviet Union tested its first nuclear device in 1949, much earlier than American experts had predicted. This began the nuclear arms race that would define the Cold War. The development of hydrogen bombs in the early 1950s increased destructive yields from kilotons to megatons. By the 1960s, both superpowers possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy human civilization many times over, a condition known as mutually assured destruction. Nuclear anxiety became a defining feature of global culture, from the duck and cover drills in American schools to the anti-nuclear movements that gained strength in the 1950s and reached their peak in the 1980s. The political ramifications of the bombings extended far beyond military considerations. The atomic monopoly gave the United States unprecedented power in shaping the post-war international order. The bombing also created moral questions that American leaders would grapple with for decades. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who had supervised the Manhattan Project, struggled to reconcile the terrible destructive power he had helped create with his hope that it might ultimately serve peace by making war too terrible to contemplate. Scientists who had worked on the bomb organized to advocate for international control of atomic energy. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, would later oppose the development of the hydrogen bomb, leading to his security clearance being revoked during the McCarthy era, a devastating professional and personal blow. President Truman maintained until his death that the decision to use the bombs had saved lives by avoiding an invasion of Japan, though historians continue to debate the evidence for this conclusion and whether alternatives might have achieved Japanese surrender without atomic weapons. The decision-making process that led to the use of atomic weapons has been extensively studied by historians. President Truman, who had assumed office only months before following Roosevelt's death, inherited both the Manhattan Project and the momentum toward using the weapon once it became available. The interim committee established to advise on atomic matters recommended in June 1945 that the bomb be used against Japan as soon as possible and without warning. This recommendation was influenced by several factors: the desire to end the war quickly, the enormous investment in the Manhattan Project that seemed to demand use of the resulting weapon, the opportunity to impress the Soviet Union with American power at the dawn of what would become the Cold War, and the view that using atomic bombs represented only an incremental escalation beyond the already devastating conventional bombing campaign against Japanese cities. A group of scientists at the Chicago Metallurgical Laboratory, led by Leo Szilard, circulated a petition urging demonstration of the bomb before use against cities, but this petition never reached Truman. The target committee selected potential cities based on military significance, size, and the fact that they had not yet been bombed, allowing for clear assessment of the new weapon's effects. Kyoto was originally on the target list but was removed by Secretary of War Stimson, who appreciated its cultural significance from his honeymoon visit decades earlier. Truman's own statements about the decision evolved over time, initially focusing on the military significance of the targets, later emphasizing the lives saved by avoiding invasion, and eventually acknowledging the terrible destructive power unleashed while maintaining that he never doubted the necessity of his decision. For the crew of the Enola, life after the mission took various turns. Colonel Tibbets remained in the Air Force, rising to the rank of brigadier general before retiring in 1966. He never expressed regret for the mission, maintaining that it had been a military necessity that saved lives on both sides. Major Thomas Farabee, the bombardier who had released Little Boy, also stayed in the military, retiring as a colonel. Captain Theodore Dutch Van Kirk, the navigator, left the military after the war and worked as a chemical engineer. Most of the crew members avoided publicity about their role, though they occasionally participated in anniversaries and historical documentations. The Enola itself was preserved, though controversially. After being displayed at several air shows immediately after the war, it was disassembled and stored by the Smithsonian Institution. A plan to display the aircraft as part of an exhibition on the end of World War II for the 50th anniversary in 1995 triggered an intense public debate about how the bombing should be interpreted historically. Veterans groups objected to what they viewed as an excessive focus on the Japanese victims and insufficient context about the Pacific War that had led to the bombing decision. After significant revisions, a much-reduced exhibition went forward, and the fully restored Enola Gay is now displayed at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center near Washington, D.C. The Smithsonian controversy highlighted the evolving American understanding of the bombings. Initial public reaction in 1945 had been overwhelmingly positive. Polls showed 85% of Americans approved of using atomic bombs on Japanese cities. The bombings were widely seen as justified retribution for Pearl Harbor and other Japanese atrocities, and as necessary to end the war and save American lives. This consensus began to fragment in the 1960s and 1970s as new historical evidence emerged, generational perspectives shifted, and the experience of the Vietnam War led to broader questioning of American military actions. By the 1980s and 1990s, American public opinion had become deeply divided. The proposed Smithsonian exhibition in 1995 became a flashpoint for these tensions. The original exhibition script included graphic photographs of victims, artifacts from Hiroshima, and discussion of the radiation effects and long-term suffering of survivors. It also raised questions about the decision-making process and necessity of the second bomb. Veterans groups and many politicians objected strenuously, arguing that the exhibition portrayed Americans as aggressors rather than emphasizing the context of Japanese aggression and the lives saved by avoiding invasion. After intense debate, the Smithsonian drastically scaled back the exhibition to focus primarily on the aircraft itself, with minimal historical context. This controversy revealed how deeply intertwined the bombings had become with questions of American identity, historical memory, and moral responsibility. Similar tensions have emerged around how the bombings are taught in American schools, presented in museums, and depicted in popular culture. The search for a balanced understanding that acknowledges both the wartime context and the human suffering continues to challenge American historical consciousness. The scientific legacy of the Manhattan Project was equally complex. The project had brought together the greatest scientific minds of the era in an unprecedented collaboration. Their work not only produced atomic weapons, but laid the groundwork for nuclear power, nuclear medicine, and advanced computer science. Many of the scientists who had worked on the bomb became prominent voices in the nuclear disarmament movement, including Leo Szilard, who had first conceived the possibility of a nuclear chain reaction and later petitioned against using the very weapon he had helped create. Einstein, whose famous letter to President Roosevelt had helped initiate the Manhattan Project, later expressed regret about his role. The scientific community's grappling with the moral implications of their work established important precedents for ethics in scientific research. The Manhattan Project also established a new relationship between science, government, and the military. The military-industrial academic complex that would shape much of post-war American research and development. The Manhattan Project transformed not only warfare, but science itself. Before the project, physics had been a relatively small-scale pursuit with modest funding. The project demonstrated the power of massive government investment in basic science and established a new model of big science that would dominate the post-war era. The project's estimated cost of $2 billion 1940s dollars, equivalent to about $29 billion today, dwarfed previous scientific expenditures and set precedents for large-scale government funding of research. The project also pioneered new approaches to scientific collaboration, bringing together specialists from different fields to work toward a common goal. The management techniques developed by General Leslie Groves and the scientific leadership of J. Robert Oppenheimer established templates for later big science projects. Computational methods developed for nuclear calculations contributed to the early development of electronic computers. The project also changed the social status of scientists, particularly physicists, who went from relatively obscure academics to celebrities and important policy advisors. In the aftermath, many scientists grappled with their new responsibilities. In 1946, Oppenheimer famously told President Truman, I feel I have blood on my hands, reflecting the moral burden many scientists carried. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, founded by Manhattan Project veterans, established the doomsday clock to symbolize how close humanity was to self-destruction. Scientists divided over whether to continue weapons work. Edward Teller enthusiastically led development of the hydrogen bomb, while Oppenheimer and others opposed it or left weapons research entirely. This division came to a head in the 1954 security hearing that stripped Oppenheimer of his clearance, effectively ending his influence on nuclear policy. Beyond the politics, the Manhattan Project's scientific achievements were undeniable, accelerating nuclear physics, chemistry, metallurgy, and engineering by decades. The challenge for the scientific community became how to preserve the benefits of this knowledge while preventing its most destructive applications, a challenge that continues to this day. In Japan, the process of assimilating the atomic bombings into national consciousness was complicated by the American occupation from 1945 to 1952, during which censorship limited public discussion of the bombings. When the occupation ended, a wave of books, films, and memoirs brought the experiences of the hibakusha to national attention. The bombing became central to Japan's post-war identity as the only nation to have experienced nuclear attacks, and to its adoption of a firmly anti-nuclear stance in international relations. The Peace Memorial Park and Museum in Hiroshima became a powerful symbol of the human costs of nuclear warfare and a center for international peace activism. The annual peace ceremony held in Hiroshima on August 6th has grown into an event of international significance. Japan's post-war constitution, largely drafted by American occupation authorities, included the famous Article 9, in which Japan renounced war as a sovereign right and pledged never to maintain military forces. Though this article has been interpreted with increasing flexibility over the decades, allowing for self-defense forces, it represented a profound national shift from the militarism of the pre-war era. The hibakusha, survivors of the atomic bombings, faced unique challenges. Beyond their physical injuries and illnesses, many encountered discrimination in employment and marriage due to fears about radiation effects and genetic damage. Many kept their survivor status secret to avoid this stigma. It was not until the 1950s that hibakusha began to organize and advocate for recognition, medical support, and compensation. The Japanese government eventually established healthcare systems, specifically for bombing survivors, and provided modest financial support. The process of documenting survivors' experiences began in earnest in the 1950s with projects like author Studs Terkel's interviews and physician Robert Lifton's psychological studies. These testimonies revealed the profound trauma of the experience, not only the immediate horror of the bombings, but the long-term effects of radiation sickness, disfigurement, loss of family and community, and living with the fear of delayed radiation effects. Many survivors described a fundamental rupture in their understanding of the world, a loss of basic trust in the natural order. Survivor accounts often describe the bombings in apocalyptic terms, the sky falling, the sun descending to earth, or hell opening up. Beyond physical and psychological effects, many survivors experienced a spiritual or existential crisis, questioning the meaning of their survival and their responsibility to bear witness. Some found purpose in peace activism, others in preserving traditional Japanese culture that might otherwise have been lost, and still others in religious faith. The hibakusha experience has been preserved through oral histories, memoirs, art, poetry, and the Peace Memorial Museums in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As the generation of direct survivors ages, efforts to document and transmit their experiences have intensified, with digital archives and educational programs aimed at ensuring these first-hand accounts are not lost to history. The international legal and ethical framework for nuclear weapons also evolved in the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The 1949 Geneva Convention prohibiting the targeting of civilian populations was drafted with the recent memory of strategic bombing campaigns, including the atomic bombings, in mind. The 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, established a framework for preventing the spread of nuclear weapons while working toward disarmament by existing nuclear powers. However, the number of nations possessing nuclear weapons has grown from 1 in 1945 to 9 today. The specter of nuclear terrorism has added a new dimension to nuclear anxiety in the post-Cold War era. International movements advocating complete nuclear disarmament have gained momentum in recent decades, with the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. Yet the fundamental dilemma remains. The knowledge of how to build these weapons cannot be unlearned, and the strategic calculation that led to their development and use in 1945 continues to influence international relations today. The scientific understanding of the bombing's health effects has evolved over decades. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established in 1946, later reorganized as the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, has conducted the longest continuous health study in history, tracking the health outcomes of bombing survivors and their descendants. Their research has been crucial in establishing radiation safety standards and understanding the long-term health effects of radiation exposure. Among the findings, increased rates of leukemia appeared within a few years of exposure, while solid cancers showed increased rates after about 10 years. The psychological effects, though less systematically studied, have been equally profound. Recent research has explored the concept of intergenerational trauma among the families of survivors and the ways in which the bombings continue to shape Japanese society's understanding of catastrophe and resilience. The long-term medical effects of the bombings created an unprecedented body of knowledge about radiation exposure in humans, knowledge that came at a terrible cost. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, ABCC, later reorganized as the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, RRF, has tracked the health outcomes of approximately 120,000 survivors and their descendants for over 75 years. This research has established that radiation exposure increases cancer risk in a dose-dependent manner, with different types of cancer emerging at different time intervals after exposure. Leukemia rates peaked 5-10 years after the bombings, while solid cancers began to appear after about 10 years and continue to occur at elevated rates throughout survivors' lives. The studies found that children were especially vulnerable to radiation effects. Contrary to early fears, no significant genetic effects have been detected in the children of survivors, though research continues. Beyond cancer, radiation exposure is associated with increased rates of cataracts, cardiovascular disease, and other non-cancer health effects. These findings have formed the basis for radiation protection standards worldwide and informed medical radiation practices, nuclear energy safety protocols, and preparations for radiological emergencies. The hibakusha have thus made an involuntary but immense contribution to global public health. The medical system that eventually developed for hibakusha in Japan became a model for comprehensive care of trauma survivors, integrating physical treatment, psychological support, and social services. The experience also demonstrated the importance of long-term follow-up for disaster victims and the need for healthcare systems that can address delayed effects appearing decades after exposure. The cultural impact of the atomic bombings has been global and enduring. From Nevil Shute's novel On the Beach to Stanley Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove, the specter of nuclear apocalypse has inspired countless works across all artistic media. In Japan, the bombings gave rise to an entire genre of hibakusha literature and significantly influenced the development of manga and anime. Keiji Nakazawa's manga series, Barefoot Gen, based on his own experiences as a Hiroshima survivor, has been translated into multiple languages and adapted into films. The bombings also entered the global visual vocabulary. The mushroom cloud became one of the most recognizable and potent symbols of the modern age, representing both technological achievement and the potential for self-destruction. The very language we use to describe catastrophic risk has been shaped by our understanding of nuclear weapons. Terms like nuclear option, atomic diplomacy, and brinkmanship have entered common usage far beyond their original contexts. The mushroom cloud quickly became one of the defining visual icons of the 20th century, appearing in everything from government civil defense materials to pop art. Films like Godzilla, 1954, processed the trauma of the bombings through metaphor, with the monsters serving as a stand-in for nuclear destruction visiting Japan. American culture of the 1950s reflected both fascination with atomic power, seen in the popularity of atomic as a marketing term and design aesthetic, and a deep anxiety about nuclear war, evident in the proliferation of fallout shelters and civil defense drills. The dual nature of nuclear technology as both miraculous and terrifying appeared in cultural products ranging from comic books to serious literature. John Hersey's Hiroshima, published in 1946, brought the human experience of the bombing to American readers for the first time, occupying an entire issue of The New Yorker. In poetry, music, theater, and visual art, the atomic bombing became a reference point for contemplating humanity's new power over its own existence. The psychological impact extended beyond specific works to influence broader cultural movements. The existentialist philosophy that gained prominence after World War II grappled directly with the implications of human technology capable of self-destruction. The environmental movement drew strength from concerns about radioactive contamination and fallout. Peace movements made nuclear disarmament a central demand. Popular culture continues to process this legacy with recent works like the television series Oppenheimer and films exploring the Manhattan Project from various perspectives. As the events recede in time, the challenge becomes how to maintain awareness of their significance without reducing them to abstract symbols or entertainment. The cultural processing of the bombings continues, reflecting each generation's attempt to comprehend an event that marked the beginning of a new era in human capability and responsibility. The diplomatic and strategic legacy of the bombings continues to evolve. The doctrine of nuclear deterrence, the idea that nuclear weapons prevent war between nuclear-armed states because of the fear of mutual destruction, has been a cornerstone of international relations since the early Cold War. Despite periods of extreme tension, direct warfare between nuclear-armed states has not occurred, lending some credence to this theory. However, the human, financial, and moral costs of maintaining nuclear arsenals have led to persistent questions about whether alternatives exist. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, demonstrating both the dangers of nuclear brinkmanship and the importance of communications and de-escalation mechanisms. In recent decades, the threat of nuclear proliferation to unstable regimes or non-state actors has added new dimensions to nuclear security concerns. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain the only use of nuclear weapons in warfare, establishing what some scholars call a nuclear taboo, a normative prohibition that has helped prevent subsequent use despite several close calls. As we approach the 80th anniversary of the bombings, the number of living witnesses diminishes each year. The average age of Hibakusha is now over 85, raising urgent questions about how the memory and lessons of the bombings will be preserved for future generations. Digital archives, oral history projects, and educational initiatives seek to ensure that first-hand testimonies remain accessible. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki themselves have taken active roles in preserving physical evidence of the bombings and promoting peace education. The A-bomb dome in Hiroshima, the skeletal remains of the former Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, one of the few structures left standing near the Hypo Center, was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1996 as a powerful symbol of human destructive capacity and the hope for world peace. Each year, thousands of paper cranes inspired by the story of Sadako Sasaki, a girl who died of radiation-induced leukemia 10 years after the bombing, are sent to Hiroshima from around the world as symbols of peace and healing. The debate over the ethics and necessity of the bombings remains as contentious today as ever. Historians continue to analyze newly declassified documents and reconsider the complex factors that led to the decision to use atomic weapons. Some scholars argue that Japan was already on the verge of surrender and that the bombings were unnecessary or primarily intended as a show of force to the Soviet Union in the emerging Cold War. Others maintain that an invasion of Japan would indeed have caused greater casualties on both sides, and that the shock of the atomic bombings was necessary to break the Japanese military's determination to continue fighting. These discussions are not merely academic, they shape how we understand the moral boundaries of warfare, the responsibilities of leadership in extreme circumstances, and the relationship between technological capability and ethical constraint. The questions raised by the Enola Gay's mission remain unresolved. When, if ever, is the use of weapons of mass destruction justified? How should societies balance military necessity against humanitarian concerns? What responsibilities do scientists have for the applications of their discoveries? Who bears moral responsibility when new technologies transform the nature of warfare? In the end, perhaps the most important legacy of the Enola Gay's mission is the ongoing struggle to ensure that nuclear weapons are never used again. The horror of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki has served as a powerful deterrent against casual or impulsive use of nuclear weapons. The vivid testimonies of survivors have humanized what might otherwise be abstract strategic calculations. Every world leader who contemplates nuclear options does so with the knowledge of what a nuclear detonation actually means for human beings on the ground. As technology continues to advance, creating new forms of potentially catastrophic weaponry, the example of the atomic bombings provides a crucial historical reference point for ethical decision-making. The story of the Enola Gay is not just about what happened on August 6, 1945, it is about how humanity has grappled with the implications of that day ever since, and how we will continue to do so as long as nuclear weapons exist. When Paul Tibbets guided his B-29 away from the mushroom cloud rising over Hiroshima, he could not have known that he had not only participated in ending one war, but in fundamentally changing the calculations that underlie all wars to follow. From that moment forward, humanity would live with the knowledge that it possessed the means to destroy itself, a sobering reality that continues to shape our world today.